I can't hear them. God's muted.
Does he know it?
Yeah, no, I know. Somebody just told him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I could hear you,
You
so
missed it last week because.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you. Thanks, Scott.
It was recorded.
She doesn't want my cool little research.
No. Oh, gosh, I end up with.
But you
know,
gotta admit, it
2 or
does solve the
3
problem.
spots.
Everybody
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, each one of the boxes go over again. 1 or 2.
It also solves another
Yes.
problem.
Well, I don't mind that, she handled it, anyway, so they let the people run guys. I was gonna go like tonight. Hope can do it. So now, it's helping the kids.
You promised when I'm putting green in the backyard.
A series of people. I'm not sure which one actually did caused the actual damage, but you should see the other guy though. He's totally fine. And so it's funny because I asked my wife earlier if I would need to explain my face.
I'm going with,
And
I'm
she
with
just-
political
and
activism.
she just said, yes. So the explanation for why I've got the marks on my face is, in a handful of months ago, I started doing, jujitsu,
Okay.
and
Does it matter?
most
Usually not.
mornings I go and do this for like an hour.
Yeah.
And today just happened to be a day where I was much more, I'm often the nail and not the hammer. But today I was very nail. And so, I got caught in a couple of situations where, my face was getting a little bit squeezed and trying to get out of that situation, got a little rubbed raw here and there, so. But, it's all in a controlled environment.
Okay, that's not good enough. It's either political activism or you just got back from skiing.
I never got this from skiing. Fortunately, I never managed to injure myself skiing, but it's, so yeah, that is why there's a handful of marks on my face, which,
You earned them.
I did earn them.
We'll give you a little bit more of a rugged look.
Well, it's funny, I had no idea, and then I got home and I go to look in the mirror, and I was like, oh, that happened, okay.
I kind of like I walked into a wall, story, use that one.
Yeah.
The funniest answer
definitely-
would have been, and you think you know my wife.
It's like, oh, we haven't told you about the Segal Family Fight Club, have we? All right, so I'm gonna give it just a couple more minutes because I see a few people still popping onto the Zoom. But then particularly since there is there's so much stuff to cover. This is and kind of going back, doing a lot of just reviewing a lot of stuff and kind of trying to plan out the sessions. It reminded me just how, just how deep one can go in studying this topic. And it's, there are some topics where, it's narrow and deep, and some topics where it's kind of broad but shallow, and this one is broad and deep, and it's just, there's so much there that we could theoretically get into. And part of honestly, the biggest challenge is just like trying to determine which things to focus on and which things to let go. And I'm not, full disclosure, I'm not particularly good at the letting go of stuff. Just because everything is like, oh, well, that's really cool, and that's interesting, and that's important, and that matters. And it's just like, it's a ton, it's just a ton of stuff, which is part of why we're doing this, because it is such a incredibly kind of deep and complex topic. That so often is rendered, there are so many attempts to render it simplistic. And it really does a massive disservice to all sides of this conflict and all of the different narratives that are at play when we, kind of reduce it to slogans and, he said, she said stuff. To me, at least, my take on this, which I think for those of you who were here last time, hopefully was apparent. For those of you who are here this time, will become apparent, that if we really respect the parties involved in this, if we really respect honesty and history and truth and real actual trying to understand all sides of this, then there is no way around. There's no quick and easy way to do that. The only way is by kind of diving in and really, kind of swimming with the sharks, so to speak, and dealing with all of the different pieces of this story and this conflict, these two different kind of peoples that are involved in it. And to me, anything other than that is just a disrespect to Israel and Israelis, to Palestinians, to everyone involved in this. And so, but yeah. So, all right. So it is 6:04, 6:05. So why don't we go ahead and dig in, and then as people pop on, we will adjust. If I need to kind of refresh anything, I will try to quickly do so. So when last we met, we dealt primarily with the pre-1948 situation in what was then known as Palestine, kind of the emergence of Zionism and not so much the European emergence of Zionism, but Zionism as it kind of manifested in the land of Israel, and then the Arab responses to that, the role of the British to some degree, and I think what I hope we saw, is that from the jump there was conflict. From the very first Zionists that set foot in the land of Israel, there were issues. Some of those issues were, in reality, exacerbated by the way the Zionist movement went about certain things. Some of those issues were exacerbated by the way the Arabs responded to those things. A lot of those issues were exacerbated by the British, who really have never, in my opinion, never really been fully called to account for their role in all of this. The French to some degree also, but especially the British. I mean, to me, when I go back and I look at the history, there were so many opportunities for the British to play a really important and positive role in what happened, and they just didn't. And it's interesting because when you read the Zionist telling of history, the British were terrible and against anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and did everything they could to thwart the Jews. And then when you read the Palestinian version of things, they're like, the British did everything they could to help the Zionists. They totally went out of their way to undercut the Palestinians and any attempts at nationalism or kind of collective action or anything like that. And so I guess, you could look at it two ways. One way would be to say, well, if everyone hates what you're doing, maybe you're doing something right. But in this case, I think it's when, everyone hated what they were doing because they just weren't doing anything good. And so, we talked about some attacks or some rioting that took place we talked about in 1921 and in 1929. We talked about some of the different British kind of commissions and whatnot. We talked about a little bit, we touched just at the end on World War II, and I shared for the last one, one of the things that I found really surprising and unfortunate, I mean, maybe putting it even too lightly, is at least in the Palestinian telling of that period of time, of their history, of their understanding of the history of that period, there is no recognition or no kind of accounting for the fact that the Palestinian Arab leadership and much of the Arab world sided with the Nazis. Now, there is an argument to be made that their siding with the Nazis was not inherently because they hated the Jews. And in fact, a lot of scholars have argued that it really was much more about them hating the British and the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So it's like, well, we hate the British, the Nazis hate the British, let's all work together to whoop up on the British. But the fact that this isn't identified, this isn't kind of just put out there as part of the reason why, especially in the aftermath of World War II, there was so much kind of animosity from the British to the Palestinian Arabs, and from the Jews to the Palestinian Arabs, I think misses the mark significantly, because that was an important piece of it, and to not kind of just acknowledge that part of their history diminishes the power and the value of that historical telling. So we find ourselves now as we start to move forward in November of 1947 with the UN partition plan. And obviously, I think we know what happens with this. It is approved in spite of the fact that there are pretty much the entire Arab world, in addition to a handful of other places, vote against it. But the majority votes for it. And one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind, the argument is made often that Israel only came to be because of the Holocaust. And I mean, in reality, that's just not true. I mean, both the Israeli and Palestinian sides of the debate acknowledge that that's not true. They have different kind of takes on it, but I wanted to read this. This comes from a Palestinian historian, and I don't remember if I read it the last time or not, but it's important just to kind of understand kind of their mindset as this was happening. The Palestinian Arabs were convinced that there was no reason for them to pay for the tribulations and torture that the Jews suffered at the hands of the Christians in Europe, which in fact amounted to a serious crime against humanity. Furthermore, Zionism appeared before the Third Reich, which meant that Zionist aspirations in Palestine preceded the great crime that befell them during World War II. It was quite baffling to the Palestinians why it wasn't fair for the Jews to be a minority in a Palestinian state, though it was deemed fair to transform half of the Palestinian people, who comprised the majority of the original inhabitants living on the land of their fathers and forefathers, into a minority living under foreign rule in a Jewish state blessed by the partition plan. So I wanted to make sure to read that because, again, we don't have to agree with it. We don't have to, think it's correct. But it is important to understand what the mindset of the Palestinian Arab community was when this was going on. And the reality is it's not unreasonable. It's not an unreasonable point of view to say, we didn't do this to them. Y'all did this to them. So y'all should be the ones to have to deal with it. Why are we kind of being forced into a situation we don't want to be in because of these things that happened in Europe, done by Christians to Jews? Why don't y'all just leave us out of it? So, while the Holocaust was not the reason for the establishment of Israel, it had been in process long before that. I also think it is fair to say that the Holocaust and the aftermath was maybe the final push that a lot of the world needed to approve this. The reality is I don't know if this gets approved if the Holocaust, the partition plan gets approved if the Holocaust doesn't happen. in part because of the eternal and I guess the ever-present anti-Semitism that exists throughout the world and pretty much always has. So, you know, there was this moment in time that kind of worked to enable this to really come through. So, you know, after the partition plan, we immediately see kind of both the Zionist side and the less so the Palestinian Arabs, but kind of like the Arab world in general start to move, you know, clearly move towards war. Skirmishes start to break out before Israel declares its independence in May. Like for the 6 months, you know, between the partition plan and the Declaration of Independence, there are all sorts of kind of military actions, paramilitary actions. There's back and forth, different people doing different things. There's a couple of moments in that period that I wanted to highlight. One perpetrated by Israel or by the Zionist movement, which was Deir Yassin. How many of you are familiar with Deir Yassin? So Deir Yassin was an Arab village, and it was attacked by the kind of two fringe groups, is maybe not quite giving them their due, but the group known as Etzel or the Irgun, as well as a group known as Lehi or the Stern Gang. And these two were kind of the more radical elements within the Zionist movement. And they were kind of loosely tied to the Haganah and loosely tied to the Yeshuv, even though they functioned independently. And there was a lot of tension between those groups. But so I'm just going to refer to them as Irgun and Lehi for brevity. So Irgun and Lehi perpetrated this attack on this Arab village, Deir Yassin, in April of 1948. The accepted historical figures at this stage are that most scholars put it between 100 and 110 people, Arabs, were killed, many of whom were non-combatants. And also in the aftermath of this attack, the way that the Irgun and Lehi soldiers kind of acted was kind of viewed as really atrocious. There were captives from the village who were kind of paraded through the streets and then dumped in East Jerusalem. There's evidence of kind of the Irgun and Lehi soldiers kind of torturing people and blowing up houses while people are still in them, intentionally killing elders, women, and children. I mean, it was an atrocity, and it was and remains a black mark on Israel's record. Now, one thing that's interesting and important to note about the aftermath of this in the moment is that the reports that came out kind of right afterwards were that 250, 300 people had been killed. A lot of the reports exaggerated the already kind of terrible things that had happened during this attack. And what makes it interesting, albeit tragic, is that all parties involved had an interest in publicizing a higher casualty figure than what actually happened. So the Haganah wanted to publish a high casualty figure to tarnish the Irgun and Lehi, because they had all kinds of internal issues between them. The Arabs and the British wanted to highlight it to make the Jews look bad. And then the Irgun and Lehi wanted to publicize this to basically to scare the Arabs, like to provoke terror. And we will see that it worked. So another thing that happened in the aftermath of this, which is maybe especially important, is after Deir Yassin, Jordan in particular, who had actually there had been a kind of clandestine agreement reached between King Abdullah of Jordan and Golda Meir. Well, hold on one second.
Is Zoom on?
Yes, Zoom's on. Between King Abdullah and Golda Meir, where essentially Golda Meir, representing the Yeshuv, representing the Zionist movement, agreed that Jordan would be able to take over the West Bank, and in exchange, Jordan would essentially stay out of whatever conflict was coming. Because King Abdullah didn't really want to get involved. Like, he was not really interested in going to war with the Zionists and with the emerging state of Israel, for a whole variety of reasons. But this agreement that had been reached in actually just like a couple weeks before the partition plan ended up being scuttled in the aftermath of Deir Yassin, because basically King Abdullah was like, I just can't now. Like, you've made it impossible for me to do this and save face. I'm also now being kind of roped into this larger, theoretically pan-Arab movement to attack you guys. And so, like, I'm out. I just can't do it. It may have also contributed to the decision of other Arab leaders to kind of be more willing to participate in the coming attack. There's a lot of evidence that Deir Yassin became kind of a rallying cry for Arab combatants who were hoping to exact revenge. And additionally, on the flip side of it, it was really demoralizing for the Palestinian Arabs and kind of their leadership, because it was seen as weakness by the Palestinian Arab leadership. And it also, as the Irgun and Lachiat Hope, it scared people. And over the coming months and year, when Zionists and then Israeli forces would go into Arab towns, there was kind of a built-in fear that it would be another Deir Yassin. And I don't know how we all may feel about it, but the Haganah and the IDF, once it became that, they used that to their advantage. I mean, they used it for psychological warfare. And so they would yell things about Deir Yassin as they were going into to these villages that they needed to take for strategic purposes or whatever, knowing that it would basically scare the bejeebus out of the people who were there. And again, like, we can all feel how we feel about it. It's a little icky, but that's the reality of what went down. And so almost just a few days later, there was a response to this, which was an attack on a convoy heading to Hadassah Hospital. And basically a group of Arab militiamen attacked this convoy of it was like 10 vehicles filled primarily with unarmed lecturers, nurses, and doctors who were on their way to the hospital. 4 of the vehicles, including 2 buses, were trapped. The British would not intervene, did not intervene, and warned the Haganah against intervening for hours and hours and hours. The shooting went on for approximately 6 hours before the buses were doused with gasoline and set on fire. And by the time the British finally, got off their rear ends and did something, 70 people had been killed. And so, and this is all before the official war has even started, right? So it gets nasty quickly.
But Scott, at that time period, were not buses and convoys being attacked from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, just resupply lines? So that was part of the tit and tat between the different groups and villages and clans.
I mean, there were attacks on supply lines in general, and the routes in and out of Jerusalem were generally controlled by by the Arabs, by the Palestinian Arabs. And you know, they made it incredibly difficult to get supplies into Jerusalem, and that became a major goal of the war early on, was to open the blockade to Jerusalem so that people could get in. And there was also just a fear that the entire Jewish population of Jerusalem would be slaughtered, and also that Jerusalem would be lost, including not just East Jerusalem, but West Jerusalem as well would be lost, and the Zionists wouldn't have it. It wouldn't be part of a state of Israel. But this was different. We could make a case, well, I will make a case, let's put it that way, that those could very easily be seen as military actions. This was not a military action. There were no supplies here. There was nothing of any sort of strategic or military value in this attack. This was just, we're mad and we are going to take revenge. And this was their revenge. So to me, it differs from some of the other kind of attacks on convoys that took place, because it wasn't motivated by strategy. It was motivated by anger. So when the war starts, right? May 1948, Israel declares its independence. We get the attack. So the narrative that a lot of us probably grew up with, heard, maybe still is the narrative that we hold on to, is kind of the David versus Goliath story, right? That Israel was David. They were massively outmanned, massively outgunned, and yet they were able to hold on and fight and succeed. That's a great story. It's also not real. So, and this is one of the really big areas of disconnect in the way a lot of Jewish people understand the history of this conflict. Because again, like I said, so many of us grew up with this idea of like Israel was the David to the Arab Goliath and all that kind of stuff. But you know, the numbers bear out that was not actually the case. So I wanted to kind of touch on we could do a whole semester just on the 48 war. There's so much there. But there's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on specifically. One is the question of relative strength, which I just alluded to. The other is the issue of refugees, Palestinian Arab refugees, because I want to talk about the relative strength because that really feeds the Jewish narrative and the Zionist narrative of what happens, or what happened, and the refugee issue because that continues to fuel much of the Palestinian Arab narrative about what happened and what is continuing to happen. And so, to better understand what's happening now, we got to understand what happened then. So in terms of general population, yes, the Arab world had a massive population advantage over the Zionist entity, whatever we want to call it, the Yishuv. But outside of that, the Yishuv actually held most of the advantages from the beginning, in terms of national organization, in terms of trained manpower, weaponry, weapons production, morale and motivation, and command and control. All of these were in favor of the Yishuv, in favor of the Zionists. In part because they had essentially been preparing for this moment for decades, really. They'd used every opportunity they had to train, to learn. That's why, we talked about last time, in the mid-30s, you have soldiers from Haganah training with the British military, training with the British police. During World War II, you had the Jewish Brigade, and they all got training. And so you have this collection of soldiers who are actually very highly trained, many of them very experienced in battle situations. And you also had a group that was singularly focused cohesive, working together towards a known and clear objective. And in the Arab world, you just didn't have that. Most of the soldiers that were fighting for the Arab countries were not particularly well trained. They tended to be not especially literate. And they just didn't have the kind of infrastructure and that the Zionists had built over, the previous 30, 40 years.
Where did the Zionists get their materials, their weapons, their?
They made a lot of them. They made a lot of them themselves. Even now, I think there are kibbutzim that have kind of like museums because it was like an underground effort to create weapons, to create ammunition, and right, all kind of under disguise and things like that. There's also a lot of effort to bring in arms from other countries. There's kind of a funny story that there was an effort made at one point by representatives from the Yishuv to connect with members of the Jewish mafia in the United States. And that there's stories that members of the Jewish mafia actually contributed to the Israeli war effort by finding ways to send, massive amounts of weapons and ammunition to Israel. So on May 15th of 1948, just to give some numbers, there were about between 30 and 35,000 soldiers for Israel. And then by June, it had increased to about 42,000 soldiers. Large shipments of light arms had poured into the country. And so the IDF had a lot of light weaponry. They ramped up their own production and they were producing. They'd already produced 7,000 Sten guns, and then by October of that year, 16,000. By the end of May of 1948, the sources say that basically Israel was producing pretty much all of its own needs for submachine guns and ammunition, light and medium mortars, anti-tank rockets, grenades, mines, and bombs. Like the one area, especially at the beginning of the war, came in the field of heavy weaponry because they just didn't have much of that. That was the one area where they were at a disadvantage to the Arab armies, at least at first. But by about a month in or so, they had accumulated some tanks, artillery pieces, anti-aircraft and anti-tank cannons, and a whole bunch of armored trucks and personnel carriers. So, really early on in the official war, Israel had done a very good job of equipping itself. By midsummer, the IDF numbers were up to 65,000 troops. By the early spring of 1949, it was 115,000. Now contrast that with the Arab armies, who had about 40,000 troops in Palestine and Sinai by midsummer of 1948, and then 50,000 in October, and maybe up to like 65,000 in the spring of 1949. So we get into like a year into the war, Israel has almost a 2-to-1 soldier advantage in terms of like trained actual soldiers. And that doesn't mean that there weren't battles or moments where Israel was outmanned and outgunned, because there certainly were, and this in no way is meant to kind of dim the valiant efforts of the Israeli soldiers, because no matter what the numbers were, the way that Israel went about fighting this fight was still an amazing thing. And for the rest of the world in particular, who had always really had always viewed Jews as kind of weak and incapable of defending ourselves. In some ways that was exacerbated by the Holocaust. This idea of an army of Jews fighting this fight and winning was shocking to a lot of people. You know, I wanted to emphasize again the importance of the centrality of command, because one of the things that often gets lost in the conversation about the 1948 war is that there was no unity among the Arab armies. There was no central command. There was no chain of command, really. There was no one person or one organization calling the shots and calling in determining strategy. Everyone, like Egypt and Syria and Jordan, and Lebanon, Iraq, like all these countries were kind of in it for themselves. And so they not only was there not like a central cohesive leadership, but a lot of times the goals of these countries were in conflict with each other. And so you ended up getting a lot of infighting among the Arab armies and the different commanders. Egypt Egypt had designs on taking over sections of the land, and Jordan had designs on taking over sections of the land, and they were worried about, each was worried about the other taking too much or getting into their space and all this other kind of stuff. And so, you had kind of so many people with so many different agendas that even if the numbers had been equal, I don't think it would have changed the result. And the other thing is that I think also sometimes gets lost in the conversation is the motivation. Like the Arab armies, what was their motivation to fight in this war? Like they really didn't have one. But for Israel, like it was win or die, basically. Like that was how they viewed it. Whether that was, whether that would have been the case if they had lost, who's to say? But that was the approach of Israel and the Israeli army was, if we don't win, we are going to die. And that's a pretty good motivator to fight when they were literally fighting for their lives, whereas on the other side they were fighting for shrug, we don't really know. And so I don't think we can. I don't think I can emphasize enough how much that ended up mattering, because in a lot of cases, when the Arab armies really found stiff resistance, they just didn't have the motivation to fight through it. And it's kind of, a lot of times you get in these situations where it's like, what are we even doing here? Like, why are we doing this again? There was not enough interest in the Palestinian cause, certainly at that point, to motivate them. They weren't really going to get much out of it individually, these Arab soldiers. And so I think at a certain point, they kind of stopped thinking that this was worthwhile. And so you have when you have on the flip side, the Israeli army massively motivated by what they view as a life or death situation, that's gonna, if all of the, like I said, if all of the things were equal, that still would have turned the tide, I think.
But would the Al-Tadin incident be an example of the fights between the Yishuv and alternative government ideas?
So, this was, the Al-Tadin was a ship carrying arms that were being sent to the Irgun, which was, kind of a splinter group from the official body. They had been kind of worked into the rest of the IDF, even though they, in some cases, still maintain their own little units. And what happened was that Ben Gurion basically, because this ship was coming during an armistice, during a ceasefire, and it would have been a violation of a ceasefire. And Ben Gurion and the Yishuv basically said, you can't let this thing come. Menachem Begin and the Irgun said, oh, yes, we can. And Ben-Gurion said, well, all right then, and blew up the ship. And the biggest thing that happened from that is that really cemented Ben-Gurion and the Labor Party as the controlling force in Israel's government. And it kind of really essentially put an end to the Irgun, because after that, they begrudgingly accepted the fact that, okay, we get it, you're in charge, we may not like it, but it is what it is. So was there another question? I thought, okay. On Zoom, you guys all good? I'm not sure where to look. Not sure what to do with my hands. We all good on Zoom? Wow, okay, excellent. Thank you for the thumbs ups. All right, so I also wanted to take a minute and talk about the refugee situation. So one of the big arguments that exists around what happened in 1948 is the Palestinians, and from this point forward, I'm just gonna, prior to 1948, Palestinians could have meant Jews or Arabs. Post 1948, it just refers to Arabs. So from this point forward, I'm gonna use Palestinians to refer to the Arab community and Israel to refer to Israel. The Palestinians claim that the IDF expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, kicked them off their land, forced them out of their homes, and created the refugee problem. One of the central Zionist narratives of certainly right after 48, but for decades afterwards, was that the vast majority of Palestinians left their homes, left their towns voluntarily, and there was a widely circulated myth that the Arab leadership, the heads, the leaders of the Arab armies had put out a call encouraging all the Arabs in the land under conflict to leave, to make it easier for them to come in and destroy Israel, after which they would be allowed to come back and loot and pillage and all that kind of stuff. So there is no evidence that happened. There is no evidence that the Arabs specifically called for people to leave their homes and leave their towns with a promise of being able to return to clean up the vast number of dead Israelis that they imagined would be there. So that, by all accounts, seems to be a fantasy. But it was a very compelling fantasy for a lot of people for a lot of years. And it also, from the Israeli perspective, relieved them of any responsibility for what happened. Now, the reality, as most realities are, is much more complicated than that. So there are a number of examples of Palestinians leaving their homes of their own accord. Particularly, interestingly enough, the more well-to-do members of Palestinian society, they were actually more likely to leave than the poor people, because they had the means to go settle someplace else, and so they would go to Cairo or Nablus or Beirut, or Amman or some of these other cities that were around, and they could reestablish themselves, and they had the means and the wherewithal to live someplace else. But for the majority of Palestinians, that was not the case. At this point, it was still very much kind of an agrarian society. It was not a particularly literate society. There was no real infrastructure or government in place to kind of help guide policies or deal with what was happening as people were kind of leaving their homes, and either by choice or by not so much choice, being put into kind of refugee settlements. And so, there is an argument to be made that, not that, yes, there were Arabs who left voluntarily, but that is not the majority. It's also not fair to say that Israel went about expelling Arabs kind of, willy-nilly. But there's always a but. While there wasn't a specific plan or a specific kind of spoken strategy to expel Arabs who were living in those areas that were meant to be controlled by Israel, based on the partition plan, there was a widely held and widely accepted belief that the fewer Arabs there were in these areas, the better it would be for Israel. Is that a nice thing to think? No. Is it an understandable thing to think given the circumstances? Yes, it's understandable. It was not ridiculous for Israel to view the Arabs of the land as enemy combatants or potential enemy combatants. And so the idea of trying to limit how many would stay in what would become Israel, the state of Israel, is understandable. And in some cases, the way they went about doing that was unpleasant and not something that we should be proud of. Was that most of the cases? No, I don't think that was most of the cases, but there were certainly incidents where that was the case. There are also situations where basically as soon as the fighting started, people were like, you know what, I don't need this, I don't want this, I'm leaving. And so one of the things that I think gets lost often in the conversation about Palestinian refugees is that it was a war. This was a war. And to pretend like this is not something that often happens in war is unfair to everyone involved. We can, and I think should, acknowledge that there were situations in which Israel did not act rightly or justly, but I also think there are plenty of situations where Israel did what any country in its situation would do. And there were plenty of situations where people left because they were afraid, which is totally reasonable. But leaving because you're afraid in the midst of a war is not someone forcing you out of your home. At least not the way it's generally portrayed in the 21st century.
Can I just ask for some clarification? As you said, some of the things that the Israelis did were not nice, but you haven't really described what they were doing to get the Palestinians to leave or decide to leave.
I mean, in some cases people were violently expelled from their homes. People were taken out at gunpoint, at tank point. I mentioned the Area scene earlier. There were certainly situations in which Israel used the knowledge of that and the fear of that to their advantage, and would either through spies or plants, or sometimes through like leaflets even, basically say like, if you don't leave, this is going to be another Area scene. And so even when they didn't use force, the threat of force was often employed to get people to leave. And so, and again, we could certainly have a debate over the kind of the ethics of that within war and all that kind of stuff, but that's a very different kind of conversation, and one that I think is broad enough that it's not something we can get into detail in this context. But it's, like I said, it's if we never want to be uncomfortable with history, then we shouldn't study history. Unfortunately, that's sometimes how it goes. Sometimes, the good guys, or, who we perceive to be the good guys, do things that we're not proud of, or not, or make us uncomfortable. sometimes people who we perceive to be the bad guys do things that we applaud. But in this case, I think there were, it's very mixed. And so when you hear Palestinians saying that they were forced off their land and exiled from their land, they're not wrong. But they're also not right, because it's, as is so often the case, it is, to, like I said at the beginning, to try and like boil this down to, pithy slogans does a disservice to everyone. Because on the flip side, there were plenty of situations in which Palestinians did leave voluntarily. And you get into like the gray a lot of times when it's like, well, they left voluntarily because they knew that tomorrow Israel was coming into their village. And so, on the one side, you could say, well, they were being threatened, and so they left because they were being threatened, and that's like, so they were expelled. But you could say, well, if you leave before anyone shows up, that's kind of on you. And so it's not being expelled. You left, you chose to leave. And this is where we get into like semantics and all that kind of stuff, which, we end up going in circles. And so, to me, the important thing to take away from this, as and I've said this before, and I'm going to probably say it 1,000 times between now and when we're all done with these sessions, like that's why it's important to actually go back and look at the history of what happened in as comprehensive a way as possible, because then we say, okay, we understand why one side might say what they say, and we understand why the other side says something entirely different, and we recognize that the truth is not even somewhere in the middle, but it's like all mishmash together. And so, for either side to claim that they are entirely right and entirely wrong does no one any good and isn't going to move the conversation forward at all. Only when both sides are willing to say, yeah, there are some things that happen that, maybe we shouldn't be so proud of, and, we have to come to terms with that. That's coming from both sides. But no one, or very rarely, are both sides really willing to engage in a conversation like that. Because as soon as especially in the contemporary context, but a situation has been created. Who's to blame? That's again a whole other conversation, where we've kind of been forced into a corner where any admission of wrongdoing or mistake or anything by Israel is pounced upon and held up as like a, see, we told you. And oftentimes the same thing happens in reverse. And so, instead of being able to have these kind of conversations where we can acknowledge the complexity of it, we kind of retreat into our corners and, scream and shout about our side of things without, because we know that as soon as we step out of our corner, we're going to get pummeled. So the 48, so yes.
Just, maybe you're getting to this, or I don't know if you've skipped over it, but was there a declaration of war against Israel, Arab countries? It's my impression. I always thought that they, as soon as that they were given the partition, that all of a sudden the war started and they were attacked or something happened.
It wasn't quite like that. After the partition plan, after the November partition plan, pretty much immediately, fighting started, but this wasn't like army versus army fighting. This was more like militia versus militia. And up until May, it was generally viewed more like a civil war, because the vast majority of the fighting was taking place within the land of Israel between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. And so there were all sorts of skirmishes, there were all sorts of activities that happened. And then in May, after the Declaration of Independence, there was a declaration of war by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon against Israel. But so it wasn't, in terms of like the official war, that didn't really start until after the Declaration of Independence. But you know, the 6 months leading up to that, all sides had been kind of gearing up for what everyone viewed as an inevitability. And while that was happening, there was all the fighting between the little militia groups and the Haganah and Palestinian groups and all that kind of thing. Does that help clarify? Okay. All right. I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys. Any questions at this point?
Just a comment. The Irgun and the Haganah and whatnot, and you may have covered this earlier in the other session, so forgive me, but just a real quick touchback. Were they instrumental in the 1930s, in the early 1940s, in reaching out to Jews, mainly in Europe, but worldwide, and trying to bring them to Israel? The people that you think of that came on the boat of the Exodus, so to speak. Or I'm thinking in terms of my own uncle who at 10, 11, 12, up until he was 16 years old in Austria, was part of a group that was being trained to bring in, and he became part of the Irgun in a different fashion. But so when we talk about this piece of the war, and yes, there were things that people did that were Jewish, it seemed like, how could they have done that? Well, they were brought in as, I believe, and this where you can correct me, as younger people, seeing what was happening to them. And this, they came back, they came to Israel seeing a lot of horror, and they weren't going to let that happen again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point to make. So there's a couple of things to respond to. One is that, yeah, throughout the 30s and 40s, there was a constant effort by the Yishuv to try and bring people to Israel. Often that was forwarded by the British, especially after 1937 in the Peel Commission, this idea of putting strict limitations on Jewish immigration to Palestine. And then once World War II started, it became even more difficult for people to try and for Jews to try and get out of Europe and get to Israel. You know, Zionism, the Zionist movement had been functioning for, you know, by the time we hit the 30s, for a good 40 years. And so there were groups all over Europe who were, you know, Zionist groups working towards what they hoped would be their eventual opportunity to come to the land of Israel. But what you said about, you know, what they had seen and what that meant when they came eventually, I think is an important point to make, which is, and it kind of ties into what I was saying before in terms of the motivation of the IDF, like this sense of like, you know, we know what just happened. We can't let that happen again. Like, we have to win or we will die. And taking that maybe even a step further, where a lot of people who came post-Holocaust who had either been in camps or had seen what had happened, this sense of this combination of fear and anger that may have motivated them even more so to, you know, to take on an approach of, we will do whatever it takes to win. And sometimes that whatever it takes turned out to be things that were a little sketchy, but it's not hard to understand their motivation. You know, when you when you just come from, 6 months ago, you were in Europe and you could still, smell the crematoriums, and now you're in Israel and you're fighting for your life. Like, it's understandable that people would think that they had to do anything and everything to make sure that they survive. And that survival instinct, this isn't just limited to this situation. I mean, there are examples throughout history of people or groups in situations where, rightly or wrongly, they believed that what they were doing was the only way to survive was to do they had to do everything they could to survive, no matter what that meant. And so you do things, when you're in that mindset, you may do things that you wouldn't normally choose to do. So, it's easy for, it's easy for me, it's easy for us to, 70 years later to 75 years later to kind of moralize about it. And I recognize the kind of problematic nature of doing that from this kind of distance. But that's also what history is meant to do, is to be able to look back on things and say, okay, we understand why it happened. Doesn't mean it was the right thing to do, but it was, we understand why it was done.
So a comment with respect to that is, in hindsight, we don't seem to have a great problem with having firebombed Dresden or dropped atomic bombs on Japan. Just so, at the time you do what you have to do. Do you know how many Jews lived in the Arab countries at the time of the partition plan and how many left?
I don't know how many lived there at the time of the partition plan. I would guess, certainly well into the hundreds of thousands, if not into the millions. Does someone actually know the numbers? I can tell you that at least not necessarily after the partition plan, but I would say within 5 years of the establishment of the state, it was basically down to zero. Some of that, a lot of that was, interestingly, in a kind of a reversal of what happens with the Palestinians. Some of that was by choice. A lot of that was not by choice. But it's once Israel was established, most of those communities wanted to come and be in Israel.
And none of them asserted their right to return to the Arab countries.
Well, actually, I know that there have been movements. I don't know how significant they've been or kind of what their status is at this point, but I do know there have been movements of people from Yemen or Iran or Iraq or whatever, that have sought to get reparations from those countries for the all the things that the Jewish communities were forced to leave behind. So no one's asking for a right of return, because I don't think there's any Jews anywhere really who are thinking, you know what, Tehran is a lovely place to live. I would really like to settle there.
Around 800,000,
What's that?
estimate 800,000.
800,000. Yeah, that sounds about right. But yeah, so there have been some movements to try and address that, but like I said, I don't know what their status, if they were. I don't think any of them were ever successful, and I don't know what their status is at this point.
I don't imagine Israel's ever thought about reparations to Arabs who left.
No, well, they thought about it. And in fact, I think in some of the peace agreements that were attempted, starting in the mid-90s, that was actually part of a lot of those, was some level of, because one of the big things I remember from, I think it was the failed Camp David Accords in 2000 between Ehud Barak and Arafat, with the Big Willie trying to navigate it. That was one of the parts of it, was there would be a fund established to help support those who had left in 48 or 67, depending on where they were coming from. And some level of acknowledgement by Israel of their role in creating the Palestinian refugee situation. That was like a big point that I know Arafat and the Palestinian Authority pushed for. And if I recall correctly, Barak was open to it. It was something that he was, I think, willing to accept if all the other things, kind of went the way they hoped them to go. So, other questions before we move on to more war and destruction?
Actually,
Can you provide some context in terms of the demography when partition happened? My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the majority of people in the land that was designated as Israel were Jewish, were part of the Yishuv, about 60%, and about 40% were Arab Palestinians. Is that your understanding?
Yeah. I think that's
and it's really, is it, 20% of the of Israel is now Palestinian. Israel is not 100% Jewish state. It is a state of, and the original Declaration of Independence actually said that this would be a state for all its citizens, not just for Jewish citizens, with equal rights across all citizens. So what about the Palestinians who stayed? The 20% that is currently Israel, are those the Palestinians who stayed? And are they getting lost in this whole narrative?
So I guess are they the Palestinians who stayed? I mean, the honest answer is I don't 100% know. I would imagine that many of them are from families who did not leave for whatever reason. And I guess I wouldn't say that they're getting lost in this, because those who stay, I mean, as we kind of go on post 48, that community plays a role in Israel's development and everything else. But in terms of kind of their specific role relative to the conflict with the kind of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I don't know how much kind of their presence really has impacted that. I know Israel will often point to the fact of there being this, not insignificant percentage of Arabs living in the land of Israel who.
So it's over a million. It's over a million people.
Yeah, who by law are, have equal rights and everything else. Again, there's a whole other conversation about, equal rights in writing and equal rights on the ground. But again, that's maybe a conversation for later. But I don't know that community necessarily is something that, so let me put it this way. That particular community is not something I'm going to really delve into too much during these sessions, in part because they, in a weird way, they kind of exist on the margins when it comes to talking about the conflict itself. They're not, they're not necessarily like actively pro-Israel, and like they're not like Zionists, but they also understand that generally they have a better situation than much of the rest, many other Arabs throughout the Arab world. And so they are also not exactly going to, jump up and down to champion an anti-Israel cause.
My understanding is that there are some very active groups within Israel that are actively working on collaboration between the Israeli Arabs and the Israeli Jews. And there's a lot of really interesting activities going along that line.
Yeah, I mean, there's, for a long time, there's been, efforts made to build up the relationship between the Israeli Arab community and the Israeli Jewish community. A lot of times those efforts are dependent on who's in government, and whether they're willing to fund those kinds of things and support those kinds of things. So, you know, without trying to get too political, currently, the current Israeli government is generally less inclined towards those kind of things, than some others have been, but it's, you know, it's an important part of the country and the culture. It's again, it's another complicated relationship because, you know, as I kind of said before, you know, what's written on paper and what is enacted in day-to-day life is not always the same. And so there have been stretches where the Israeli Arab community has not been treated fairly, at least relative to Israeli Jews. But in many cases, even then, they are still in a better situation than a lot of the rest of the Arab world. And so it's, you know, it's a sticky one because, you know, there are also people who live, you know, Arabs who live in Israel who would like to see the establishment of a Palestinian state, not because they want to live in it, but because they think that is the right and fair thing to do. You know, there are Arab political parties who, you know, support those endeavors and who actively work to try and bring about negotiations between you know, Israel and the Palestinians. But their success is very, you know, fluctuates considerably from kind of election to election. And a lot of times it's much more a lot of times their electoral success is tied much more to the economy than to the peace process. Okay. Other questions before we move on to the next war? We are all war all the time today, so strap in.
Scott, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Rabbi Scott, I'm sorry. Can you comment briefly as this relates to the term Judea and Samaria as opposed to the West Bank and in the history of Israel at this time that you're teaching us on? And is that a term that, I mean, clearly it has political connotations that you use nowadays, but what was the history of that terminology and frame you're teaching today?
So, you know, full disclosure, you know, my knowledge of that specific kind of the history of that specific terminology is somewhat limited. But what I'll put out there is this: the reemergence of Judea and Samaria as the terms used to describe, you know, for those areas. So what we're talking about is what's known today generally as the West Bank, encompasses the areas that were traditionally known as Judea and Samaria. And up until 1967, that terminology wasn't used quite as much. It was generally more thought of as like, well, Jordan, or the West Bank of Jordan, or, you know, things like that. I would say the reemergence of Judea and Samaria as terms specific, you know, those terms were brought back very intentionally and for political purposes. And it was connected to the emergence and growth of the settler movement post 67. Especially when you start to get kind of the growth of the religious settler movement, the idea of being able to go to these biblical places and reestablish Jewish communities in these biblical lands, in part led to the kind of reemergence of the biblical terminology for the spaces. Now, of course, as you said, usually if someone refers to those areas as Judea and Samaria, it is very much a political statement. It tends to be limited to the national religious movement within Israel, although not only them. But generally, outside of those communities, the area is referred to as the West Bank. So that, I know that doesn't fully answer the question, but does that a little bit answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. It's helpful.
Okay, so, man, time flies when you're talking about all sorts of craziness. All right, so I'm gonna try and get us at least through, God, there's so much stuff here. At least through, well, let's just go and we'll see what happens. So 48 is, after 48, we have kind of a period where the Palestinians aren't really sure what to do. There's a lot of refugee status. Jordan is not interested in absorbing them into Jordanian society. Egypt is not really interested in absorbing them into Egyptian society, although the Palestinians in Gaza did tend to have a lot more kind of freedom and leeway than those in the West Bank, because Jordan very much sought to annex the West Bank kind of fully and really make it part of the country of Jordan, whereas Egypt was not interested in making the Gaza Strip really a part of Egypt. They wanted Sinai, but not Gaza. No one seems to like the Gaza Strip, so
And it's
which is too bad, because it's
Beachfront.
right.
I think
And
Gazans like the Gaza Strip.
I'm not even sure Gazans like the Gaza Strip at this point. I mean, it's unfortunately, like, this is one of those kind of great misfortunes about this whole situation is the Gaza Strip could be like a beautiful, amazing place, and for 1,000 different reasons, from all different, from 100 different sides, no one's been willing or able to create a situation where that could happen. I've joked is not the right word, but for years that, like, if Israel and all the surrounding countries could kind of like get over themselves and kind of come to some kind of agreement and make things work, that whole region could be just the most spectacular place on earth, and it is such a waste. Speaking of Sinai, see how I did that there? So for the 7 or 8 years following the War of Independence, or as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba, the catastrophe. And while I know I have feelings about it being referred to as that, I'm sure many of us do. We can understand why, from their perspective, they would see it that way, even if we think their perspective is flawed. So you have massive immigration into Israel, especially from the Arab countries, because there was increasing violence against Jewish communities, but also they just wanted to be in a place where they could kind of live their life without fear, and where they imagined the kind of opportunities would be, there would be more opportunities available, economic, social, cultural, otherwise. And there's some great stories about some of the airlifts that were done of Iraqi Jews and Yemenite Jews. Some really amazing stories from that. And then, throughout this time, it's not like Egypt and Jordan and Syria were like, oh, you know what, good job, you beat us, so everyone, live and let live, and let's all go on our merry way. There was still considerable tension, especially there were repeated incursions from Gaza and from Egypt into Israel by groups known as Fedayeen, who were basically like precursors to little terrorist cells. They would cross the border. They would sometimes kill people, sometimes just destroy things. And Israel would sometimes respond. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, it's all too familiar. And then at a certain point, so this was an ongoing struggle that Israel was dealing with, less so from the Jordanian side or from some of the other places, but it was also happening there. And then what happened in 1956 is Egypt had a new leader, a relatively new leader. We know him as Nasser, everybody's buddy. And Nasser was kind of starting to show some interest in connecting with Russia and the Soviet Union, which made the British and French in particular very, very nervous. The US too, but less so. The British and French also got really salty about Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal, because it essentially removed their control over that, which had been a point of pride and power for Britain and France. So in October of 1956, anyone here speak French? S-E-V-R-E-S?
Yes.
S-E-V-R-E-S with a Sèvres conference.
Yeah.
So at this conference, Britain and France and Israel kind of get together and agree to basically a three-pronged assault on Egypt. So they were going to collectively attack Egypt. Collectively, I think, is using that term very loosely, because what Britain and France wanted to do basically was, because their goal was to kind of conquer and then retake control over the Suez Canal. Israel hoped to, if not destroy, at least cripple the Egyptian army and the bases in Gaza that these Fadayin were working out of, and with the kind of ultimate hope of annexing at least a big chunk of the Sinai Peninsula, if not all of it. So the idea was that Israel would launch an attack on the Suez Canal, essentially. And then Britain and France would ride in as the peacekeepers to, basically like separate the children. And then, okay, you can't play with it, you can't play with it, so I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna hold it until everyone can calm down. That like, I'm being a little bit snarky about it, but that was essentially the idea, that Britain and France would come in, and say, okay, the grown-ups are here now and we're gonna take control of the Suez Canal. Hey, aren't we so nice? The problem was Israel did its job a little too well and moved so quickly and so effectively that the French and the British would get their act together fast enough to do their part. And by the time, like before the French and British could like even get to this, to the Suez Canal or get to the part of it that they really needed to, a ceasefire was put in place. And eventually, first of all, and basically the rest of the world looked at this and was like, come on, guys, like this is ridiculous. The US and the USSR, which, in 56, not friends, this was like one of the few times that they were both like, yeah, that was messed up. You guys shouldn't have done that. And so eventually the ceasefire holds, but Britain and France, to their credit, were able to save face by convincing the United Nations to put a force to control the canal zone in order to oversee British and French interests. So it was generally viewed as kind of a mess. Even with the little bit of face saving that Britain and France did, like it was still viewed as a pretty big botched effort by them. And for Israel, it had mixed results. The positives were that, the Egyptian, like the border tensions between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan kind of simmered down a little bit. The attacks lessened. The Arab armies were kind of shook by what they saw, by how quickly Israel just came in and put it to them. And so they essentially were, the phrase that I saw, which I really liked, is they didn't want to provoke the Israeli tiger. Because they knew, they were like, we can't beat that. Like if we fight that, we will lose. And so they didn't want, to, I don't know if it's still a phrase that's used, but they didn't want that smoke. But on the negative side of things, this led to a distinct uptick in the radicalization of the Arab populations. And Nasser in particular began to speak openly of a need for a third round in which Israel would be destroyed. And Israel was now kind of viewed as like an imperialist puppet, because they had gone along with the British and the French, who were viewed by Egypt, by Palestinian Arabs, by pretty much the entire Arab world as imperialist, colonialist forces. Israel was now kind of viewed as their lackey, which didn't really help anything. All right. So between 56 or post 56, everything again kind of like settles down, at least to some degree. Nothing's ever quiet. I don't think things have ever really been quiet in the entire history of the region, but things are quieter than they had been. And then in 1967, we start to see things ramping up again. And now we all know how this ends. Like, this is one of those, like, you know how the story ends. So let's tell the rest of the story to see how we get to the ending. So one of the things that kind of gets the ball rolling is in the late 50s and early 60s, we see the establishment of what becomes known as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and particularly a segment of it called Al-Fatah. And starting in about 1964, they begin doing these kind of cross-border attacks, some terrorist-y sorts of things. We see an increase in clashes between Israel and Syria over water and land use connected to the Jordan River. And then in 1966, we get the Ba'athist regime that takes power in Syria. That's the al-Assad crowd. And they start talking about waging a war of liberation in Palestine. Interestingly, so warnings that Israel was building up its forces along the Israel-Syrian border in preparation for an assault against the Golan Heights were being put out by Damascus. Damascus was saying all this stuff like Israel's getting ready to attack the Golan. Israel's getting ready to attack the Golan. And they go to the Soviets, who are kind of their buddies at this point, and say, hey, Israel's getting ready to attack the Golan. And the Soviets come in without really doing any looking around and say, yeah, Israel's getting ready to attack the Golan. When all like kind of the other intelligence agencies around the region are like, what are you talking about? There's nothing there. Like this is just not a thing. But this heightens tensions even further because there's this belief that this is happening. And so the Soviets then inform, because they don't read their own intelligence apparently, the Soviets inform Egypt that Israel is massing troops and is intending to invade Syria. So Egypt, in response to this, so this happens in May 13th of 1967. The Soviets tell Egypt, hey, Israel's going to invade Syria. Beginning May 14th, so the very next day, Egypt sends 100,000 troops, 800 to 900 tanks, and more than 700 pieces of artillery into defensive positions in depth along the border with Israel. So Egypt's now putting all their people out there. And at first, everyone kind of thought, okay, they're just, this is a peacock move. Like they're showing, that, hey, we're strong too. But no one really thought at that point that this was like the first step towards a war until a couple of days later, when Egypt abruptly demands the evacuation of the like 3,500 United Nations troops from Sinai and Gaza. So when that happens, now everyone's starting to pay attention and say, wait a second, what's really going on here? And interestingly, the UN Secretary General unquestionably accepted Cairo's right to demand the withdrawal of these people, which surprised everyone, like maybe Nasser more than anyone else, because what a lot of historians say now is that Nasser didn't actually want to go to war. He kind of thought like he would make his show of force. The UN would say, hey, cut it out. And he could kind of say, hey, you know what? My hands are tied. The UN is saying that we got to step back. So, but at least he could kind of, preen and posture about being willing to, stand up to the big Israeli bully. But the general consensus is that like Nasser didn't really want to engage, but his hand ended up kind of being forced by the UN saying, yeah, sure, we'll get them all out of there. You do you. So then, after this, kind of once his hand is forced a little bit, he essentially is like, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And so May 23rd, Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran and bars the Gulf of Eilat to Israeli ships. Now, all of these things that are happening, the moving in of troops and artillery, the closing of the Straits of Tiran, the removal of the UN soldiers, all of these by previous treaties, constitute official acts of war. And so, like, you can see, so that matters in just a bit in the aftermath of what happens, because it gives Israel's claim that this was a war of self-defense legitimacy, whereas it might not have had it otherwise. And in response to the closing of the Straits of Tiran, Israeli military people essentially said, if Israel does not respond to the closure of the Straits, the Arab states will interpret Israel's weakness as an opportunity to assail her security and her very existence. So, they understood that you can't just let these things slide. And again, how is this relevant to today? We see it happen all the time when there's an attack on Israel by, whether it's the Palestinians or anyone else, Israel responds because they understand that in this region, just letting these things happen is a sign of weakness. And when your enemy views you as weak, they are more likely to attack. And we can get into the psychology of it another time, but that is the reality then and continues, unfortunately, to be the reality now. So May 30th, King Hussein of Jordan flies to Cairo and signs a mutual defense pact with Nasser. A couple of days later, Egyptian commando battalions were flown to Jordan. And then on June 4th, an Iraqi mechanized brigade crossed into Jordan and began moving to the Jordan River. Egypt and Iraq signed a mutual defense pact. Throughout the Arab world, there's also these broadcasts kind of whipping people up into a frenzy kind of about, the coming war, and that this is where we start to get, we're going to destroy the Zionists, we're going to, push them into the sea, we're going to kill them all that kind of rhetoric that it kind of became a standard. And an important thing that happens in all of this is that the US at a certain point knows that Israel is thinking about attacking, and essentially doesn't say like, yes, please go do it, but also doesn't say don't do it. So there's kind of a tacit approval by the United States. And then, we kind of know what happens next. Israel launches one of the kind of more impressive military actions of the modern age. They wipe out the Egyptian Air Force. They basically just take it to them, and it's almost over before it's begun. And not only do Egypt and Jordan and Syria and everyone else not gain any territory, but they lose all their stuff. So, Israel ends up controlling the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. They end up controlling the entirety of what we know as the West Bank. They end up controlling the entirety of the Golan Heights, all within this 6-day period. And it's really from this point forward, that the Palestinian issue becomes a central issue. And that's why the 6-Day War is such an important moment, because not only the territorial pieces and all of that, but in the aftermath of this is where we really see kind of the bringing of the Palestinian situation to national or to international attention. In part because now now that Israel controls the West Bank, that's 1 million Palestinians now under Israeli rule, control, however you want to do it, whatever you want to call it. This heightened kind of nationalist sentiment within the Palestinian society. It also kind of put them front and center in the struggle against Israel, militarily and otherwise. And the sense among some of the Arab countries was, okay, well, we can't defeat Israel in a regular war. Our armies can't beat their armies in like a normal kind of face-to-face thing. Maybe we can use guerrilla warfare to weaken them enough that we can get some of the things we want. And we also start to see the real growth of Soviet influence in a lot of the Arab countries, particularly Syria and Egypt. All right, 7:33. If you guys, what do you guys think? We can try and get through the Yom Kippur War here in the next like 15 minutes or so, or we can call it and then pick up there next time. I'm open to either. Does everyone want to hang out for 15 minutes and see what we can get through? Or do people got to roll?
I'm gonna have to know.
Okay, well, why don't we save it for next time? Yeah, it's looking like we may need to add some sessions to this, which, I've, like I said at the beginning, I think as I've been going through all of this and kind of trying to think about what to talk about, I get myself lost in lost in all the minutia, but also just like not even the minutia, like there's just so much there. And also since I'm really interested in it and love studying it, I just kind of, I get all fired up for it and find all sorts of fun, interesting things that I hadn't necessarily noticed before. Fun being used extraordinarily loosely. By fun, I mean tragic and horrible.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah, so, well, thank you guys so much for being here. I know like
Thank
it's
you.
a ton of information and a lot of stuff. Thank you all on Zoom for being here. If you have questions over the coming week, email me and let me know. scottsegal18@gmail.com is the best way to reach me. I will do my best to answer questions as they come. Some of the questions I've gotten asked so far are phenomenal questions that people have written theses on. So I will do my best to answer them in a non-thesis length. But thank you all so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Next week,
Thank
right,
you.
yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
This
Bye,
is
everyone.
very interesting. This is very-
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. This is very interesting. I'm sorry, Rabbi Segal, I'm sorry.